I'm President McAllister. I want to welcome you all here. Thank you very much for coming. Even for the folk that come from Liverpool, a special one, and all the speakers too. And it's great to see so many here. We're going to have a treat, we're going to have a really good time. The programme, yes, it is impossible, and that's very much like the Vigil. We have 6 sites to visit, 10 Vigil stories to hear, and at least 3 songs to sing. So, Dennis Canavan, Labour MP for 26 years, Independent MSP for 8 years. When he was first elected for Falkirk, he had the highest majority of any MSP that term. He was chair of Yes Scotland for 2 years and distinguished himself there again. He's been a champion of social justice and sovereignty for the Scottish people all his adult life. His son Mark was one of us. Jerry might mention that in his comments. Please welcome Dennis Canavan.
Good evening everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words in commemoration of this momentous event. I remember well the aftermath of the 1992 general election, the 4th Tory victory in a row, and there was an air of despondency, despair, desolation. It was almost as if there was a massive hangover throughout the whole of Scotland. And all credit to a few brave, courageous souls who kept the flag flying and who began this vigil, a vigil which was to last 1,980 days, right up until the referendum, that historic referendum result in 1997, the 11th of September 1997, when the people of Scotland delivered a Scottish Parliament in that important referendum. Of course, the campaign for a Scottish Parliament goes back a long, long time. Arguably, it goes back to 1707, when the people of this great city literally took to the streets in protest against the Act of Union, which effectively demolished the old Scottish Parliament. And then, later on, at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, with people like Keir Hardie, the founding father of the Labour Party, who campaigned consistently for Home Rule for Scotland. And later on, in the 20th century, with people like Robert Cunningham Graham, Don Roberto, to give him his Latin American name, the founding father of the Scottish Labour Party, and also founding father of the National Party of Scotland, which merged with the Scottish Party to form the Scottish National Party, which has campaigned, of course, for nearly 90 years for an independent Scottish Parliament. And then later on, in the 20th century, we had people like Robert McIntyre, who was the first SNP Member of Parliament for Motherwell, elected in a by-election in 1945, and later on, in that same century, the famous victory of Winnie Ewing in the Hamilton by-election. The 1970s brought the Kilbrandon Report, which led to the 1978 Scotland Act, and that would have been implemented if it hadn't been for a Scottish Labour MP. Well, he represented an English constituency, but he was born in Dunfermline, a guy called George Cunningham, who scuppered the 1979 referendum by introducing the 40% hurdle, whereby not only was a simple majority enough, but you had to have 40%, not of those voting, but 40% of the electorate. And I remember that as if it were yesterday. I was a young Labour MP at that time. I had hair in my head, I had fire in my belly, and I had huge optimism. I actually thought that the Scottish Parliament, or Scottish Assembly as they called it at that time, was just round the corner. And I thought that we could defeat George Cunningham's amendment. And I remember a meeting with Michael Foot, who at that time was leader of the House of Commons. And Michael called me into his office and asked me to move an amendment to defeat the Cunningham amendment. And I was fairly confident that we'd be able to do so, but it was not to be, and the rest is history. It's worth remembering, by the way, that 52% of the people who voted in favour of that Scottish Assembly at that time. The result was 52-48. Very, very similar, almost identical to the UK Brexit result. And yet the Brexit thing was carried, and they told us away back in '79 that the 52-48 wasn't a good enough result. So much for the duplicity of the Westminster government. And then after the referendum, of course, there followed very soon the May election in 1979. Margaret Thatcher came to power and proceeded to foist upon the people of Scotland a whole series of policies which had been quite clearly rejected by the people of Scotland at the ballot box. But it wasn't just Margaret Thatcher that was our enemy. I remember there were Labour MPs at the time, members of my own party, who were vehemently opposed to a Scottish Parliament. They just wanted to bury the commitment there and then. And I can remember some of them castigating me because I had the audacity to join the cross-party campaign for a Scottish Assembly, as it was called at that time, which later became the campaign for a Scottish Parliament, which led to the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which in turn led to the Scottish Parliament. So it was a long, hard struggle. And it was a struggle which was eventually victorious, not simply because of parliamentary pressure, but also extra-parliamentary activity, and above all, people power. It was the people of Scotland who delivered that victory in the referendum of 1997. However, there is still unfinished business. Let us not be magnanimous, let us not be complacent. We have a lot of work to do yet, a lot of unfinished business, because when you think of it, one of the biggest arguments that was used for the establishment of the Scottish Parliament was the democratic deficit. The fact that no matter how we voted in Scotland, we could be outvoted at Westminster. These people down at Westminster could outnumber us and outvote us on many important issues. And that democratic deficit is still with us today. We just need to look at contemporary Scotland. We were kicked out of the European Union against the wishes of the people of Scotland. We have weapons of mass destruction based on the River Clyde against the wishes of the people of Scotland. We have an economic policy thrust upon us which we did not want, a policy which makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, and you've got these so-called non-dom billionaires taking their money out of the country, money which could be invested into this, have a better Scotland today. And of course we have things like energy, which is still mostly vested. The powers of energy are still, for the most part, retained at Westminster, and so the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power, for example, to introduce a freeze on energy prices or a windfall tax on the energy companies. When we look at things like immigration policy, we are crying out for labour in many sectors, and yet people who would willingly come and live and work and make their homes in Scotland, they cannot get visas, they cannot get work permits, and the refugees from war-torn countries like Ukraine are being turned away or being held up because we do not have control over our visa and immigration system. So these are just some of the things that illustrate that democratic deficit is still with us, and I firmly believe that democratic deficit will continue until such time as we have an independent parliament in an independent Scotland. Yes. And I do not see independence as an end in itself. I see it as a means towards an end, a means towards building a better Scotland, a fairer Scotland, a Scotland that will play its full part in the international community and help to build a better world. So when people say, what about Indiref 2? I say, bring it on, bring it on, let's go for it. Let's build that better future, let's build that better Scotland, let's build that better world. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful, thanks Denison. It's
Thank you
been
very
recorded. It was just a great short history of the independence democracy movement. Devolution is part of democracy. We won't get it fully until we're independent.
It's 30 years since I came here. I came here first on the Saturday after the election night. It was about lunchtime, and I came up with a bunch of people, and we were over there on the cobblestones to the right of the gate. And I remember these men from Skye, in full Highland regalia, had been there on the Friday night, and I joined the group and was mingling around, and I overheard Neil Atkinson, the journalist, say that night on the Saturday there was going to be a meeting of civic leaders at Carberry Towers. So I'll go out there and see what's going on. And on getting there was a very large turnout of civic leaders, media people, politicians, singers from different bands at the time. And many of those people went on to different streams around independence and the idea of democracy for Scotland. Some went on to Scotland United and some went on to other civic platforms. But what I do remember vividly is one of these singers, very popular singer at the time, standing up at the end saying, enough of the talk, I think what would be really good is if everybody left this building and descended en masse on the then beginning Vigil. And I thought to myself, that's a good idea, and I planned to do it. So off I trotted, and I came up here about 10 o'clock at night. And what was stark to me was that no one else came from that meeting. So I thought, oh, what's happening? And so it just turned out to be the men from Skye again, and a few others at the time. So that was my first night at the Vigil, which would be the Saturday night. Over time it grew. It grew from sitting out on the cobblestones with a brazier. So there was a fire on the first and second night. It then led over time to more people joining in the weeks following. A porta-cabin which switched over here. I personally got a telephone line put in. So it gradually grew. But what didn't change was that it was a kind of consensus all the time at the Vigil. It was always about agreement. And I think first and foremost for me the Vigil was a symbol. That was it really. That was it at the beginning, it was that in the middle, and it was that at the end for me. It was kind of holding out an alternative view of what was then dominant, which was misrepresentation of the Scottish people through a minority government, if you will, in Scotland. And in a sense, the Vigil, being a symbol, had no actual power. But as we know, in powerlessness, you have quite a lot of power, actually. That's the fundamental truth of it. If you've got no institutional power, the symbol becomes quite important to people. And I think what people saw in the Vigil was themselves. It could be political if you wanted it to be political, and there was a lot of political people here. I wasn't particularly political, but it could also be civic, which was probably, in my mind, it was a civic response, a symbolic response, the demand for change, and what the change would turn out to be didn't particularly interest me at that time. What was interesting was I didn't like the status quo, and so whatever evolved democratically would be good. So I think it encompassed everybody and a lot of ideas. And just to finish, we all had nicknames at the Vigil. Mine was Jerry the Sleeper, which speaks for itself. That was given to me by Louis the Book. I used to leave here after a night shift and go to the Old Royal Infirmary to work. And when I walked in, all the girls in the department would say, "Oh, the Vigil last night?" because they could smell me as I walked in. After about a year here, I left to work in America, came back, picked up again. It just carried on, had a life of its own. And I think for me why it worked was people spoke to the Vigil and the Vigil spoke to them. And that's the fundamental truth of why it worked. That's why it was effective and was part of the contribution towards democracy in Scotland. And in its own small way made a difference. And I guess that's why, even today, why we're here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. That was lovely. I think we have some our memories slightly, possibly mixed up on a few things which happened. My remembrance is, which was his, is that on the night. See, that's what used to happen all the time at the Vigil. That's very true. So yeah, they used to pump their horns, and that always used to give us that little bit of lift, and we used to wave to them as they went by. But my recollection, I was office manager and development coordinator of the Scottish Green Party in 1992. And I got a call from Lorraine Mann, who is part of this Scottish campaign to resist the atomic menace, and I shared an office space with them. And Lorraine said to me, "Look, Mike, I had a bit of a reputation as a campaigner. Look, Mike, we can't just let this carry on. We've got to do something. We've got to show that we care, that we cannot allow this to carry on, continually voting for parties which we are not represented by." So I said, "I completely agree." So I phoned up a lot of people. Scram phoned up a lot of people, and we arranged to meet up here the day after the general election, probably about 8 o'clock. We arranged to meet, may have been earlier, and there was a few people up here. I think Jerry might have been here. There's possibly 100 people in total, and it made the 9 o'clock news nationally. And when I say nationally, I don't call this place the United Kingdom, I call it the disunited kingdom, okay? And I think everybody should start using that term, because it's a very disunited kingdom. So we came up here and we contacted various media outlets. The BBC came up, filmed it, and it was on the BBC in the disunited kingdom. First item on the 9 o'clock news that night was the demonstration, and of a friend who had sadly died, who we will later move on to, was seen burning a Tory poster which had come from one of these lampposts in the days when you were allowed to actually put posters up on lampposts. So we were just kind of hanging about, and I thought, well, you know, I've got this tendency to organise things, as some of you probably know. So I became the coordinator from then, I suppose, and was sort of accepted later on by the group. And The next day, Jerry had stayed that night, and some other people had stayed that night in one of the little enclaves in that building there, which has now got this wonderful name, which is what's it called? The Parliament House. That's you know, that building there was meant to be the Scottish Parliament. That building right there was meant to be the Scottish Parliament, and that's why we were right here. But somebody had the idea they build that horrible monstrosity down the way. What happened from then on was we spent, Jerry said 10 days, it was about 10 days. Jerry, Lewis the Book. What was your nickname again?
Jerry the Sleeper.
Jerry the Sleeper. He was found to be sleeping over in front of those gates with no shelter, in the cold, you know, and showing his determination and his commitment, which is laudable. As was Lewis the Book, who's that's another story.
And what was your nickname?
I probably had a nickname that.
What was his nickname?
Mike the Mighty.
Mike the Mighty, that'll do. So, after about 10 days of this horrendous conditions for these really loyal and dedicated people that were here outside these gates, Pat Kane from Hue and Cry and regular music came up to me. Everyone was going, "Oh look, it's Pat Kane." I'm going, what's this? So I never knew Hue and Cry or Pat Kane. So he came up to me and he said, blah, 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 and we ended up, he offered us a porter cabin for a month. And the rest, I suppose, I took on, there's two names, there's the Vigil for the Scottish Parliament, there's Democracy for Scotland. The Vigil is obviously the visible outrage, but there were two arms for it, so there was a group of us who took on the politicians on the political level, who were more like Democracy for Scotland, if you like. So on that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
There's such a connection with George Wiley and the Vigil, and David, I think, is going to bring that out. And once David Livingston has spoken, Adrienne is going to, I hope you're going to recite.
Oh yes, I've got it
all
here.
right, she really has learned it. A wonderful extract of the poem "Open the Doors" from Edwin Morgan, and it's a long poem, but we're just going to hear an extract. But it says so much about vision and what we wanted, what we didn't want actually, from the new Scottish Parliament. So David, can you take over please? Yes. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to say a few words about George Wiley and maybe another couple of cultural figures that were associated with the Vigil. George used to stop off at the Vigil with his wife. His wife would sit in the car, and George would pop in for a chat or a cup of coffee with us all. There's three things that George, we can remember that he contributed to the Vigil. First of all, there was the cannon. Now I brought an example of that along for you. That was the cannon that stood outside the Vigil for a long time, and it always pointed in the direction of the Scottish office. The point of that was because it was to represent that the power lay not with the Scottish office but with the people of Scotland. So that was one of George's endearing contributions to the Vigil, and it actually ended up in someone's garden once it was all finished. So it may be still there to this day. The other thing, George.
Can we borrow it? Can we borrow it?
Yeah,
Use it again.
of course
I think
you
it's
can.
necessary.
Yeah. The other thing George contributed was what was called a brazier burner. Now there is a photo of that in existence, and it actually looks like a rocket. So we have no idea whatever happened to that, but I don't really think it lasted as long as the cannon did. And the third thing that we can remember about George and what he contributed was, of all things, plastic bags. Now, I started by bringing along a couple of photos of the plastic bags. However, thanks to Gillian, we have the originals.
Yay!
So it's got George's Destiny on one side, the Saltire on the other, and if you look in closely, you can see George Wiley's signature, bottom right hand corner. So I think we believe there's only about 20 of these carrier bags left in existence. So I think one or two will end up in the one or two will end up in the museum. So as well as being a great contributor in cultural terms to the Vigil, George was also a great financial contributor as well, and he was a great supporter of us. Quick mention of another two Scottish culture icons of the era who supported us very well was Hamish Henderson, who's someone I think was going to talk about later on. So I'll just briefly mention a quick story about Hamish Henderson. I was on duty one night, and Hamish and I think one of his daughters came along, and Hamish ended up round the brazier just singing his songs. But he started off by not letting on who he was. But we knew very well who he was, and we talked about Scottish folk music, and he mentioned, do you like any of the old songs? Which gave us our opportunity to say, yes, of course we do. And he duly sung John McLean March, and of course Freedom Cavalier. The last person to mention, who was never really actively associated with the Vigil, was the author William McIlvanney. Now, William McIlvanney was a great supporter of Scotland. He was never actively involved with the Vigil, except for one evening whereby he was at a literary event in Edinburgh and came along one night, rather worse for wear, and I was on duty again, and he said to me, "That is the worst fucking night I have ever been at in my life. Very, very boring." I will apologise in part of the language, but that was what William McIlvanney said last on his visit.
It's just proper Scottish, it's fine.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with it.
So Bill McIlvanney then spent the rest of the evenings with two of us, and we all ended up in the Royal Oak for a few beers, and he did leave a generous donation which we then put into the collection box. So that's three great Scottish icons of the 1990s: George Wiley, Hamish Henderson, and William McIlvanney. And one of the great regrets perhaps is they weren't all there at the same time.
And Dougie MacLean used to come down.
And Dougie MacLean as well, yes. Dougie MacLean wasn't someone I met, but he was also a great contributor to the Vigil, both in a financial sense and in a cultural sense.
So shall we give them all a hand?
A big round of applause for these three guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, okay. So this is the poetic culture bit. This is Open the Doors, a poem by Edwin Morgan, who was Scotland's first macker. It was written for the opening of the Scottish Parliament, and it was read by Liz Lockhead at the Parliament's opening, the Parliament building at Holyrood, on the 9th of October 2004. So this is Open the Doors,
Do you want to
an
introduce
extract.
yourself?
And my name is Adrian Murray. Open the Doors, an extract. What do the people want of this place? They want it to be filled with thinking persons, as open and adventurous as its architecture. A nest of fearties is what they do not want. A symposium of procrastinators is what they do not want. A phalanx of forelock tuggers is what they do not want. And perhaps, above all, the droopy mantra of "it wasn't me" is what they do not want. Dear friends, dear lawgivers, dear parliamentarians, you are picking up a thread of pride and self-esteem that has been almost, but not quite, oh no, not quite, not ever broken or forgotten. When you convene, you will be reconvening with a sense of not wholly the power, not yet wholly the power, but a good sense of what was once in the honour of your grasp. All right, forget or don't forget the past. Trumpets and robes are fine, but in the present and the future, you will need something more. What is it? We, the people, cannot tell you yet, but you will know about it when we do tell you. We give you our consent to govern. Don't pocket it and ride away. We give you our deepest, dearest wish to govern well. Don't say we have no mandate to be so bold. We give you this great building. Don't let your work and hope be other than great when you enter and begin. So now, begin. Open the doors and begin.
Even then, a wish, a mind its power, a wish that to my latest hour shall strongly heave my breast, that I, for poor old Scotland's sake, some useful plan or book could make, or sing a sang at least. We enjoyed all sorts of songs at the Vigil. Some had meaning to us, Hamish Henderson's We Come All You. Some were just for simple amusement. We all live in a yellow porta cabin, etc. And it was probably inevitable that Robert Burns would appear on the programme. We had freezing cold Burns nights in January, we had slightly warmer Burns nights and a halves in July, and his verses would turn up here and there as the mood took people. Every so often, people say something like, "Oh, Burns would support this or that." Do you remember the time that Ian Lang found a couple of lines of verse that proved that Burns was a unionist? So nobody can rightly claim him as a supporter of a current cause. That's false and it's arrogant. But we do know that some of the principles that Robert Burns clearly stood for were principles we at the Vigil held. Later this evening, we're going up to the Democracy Cairn. One of the wee plaques has the Burns quote on it from A Man's a Man. The rank is but the guinea stamp. The man's the gowd for all that. In 1795, the meaning of that would have been quite obvious, but it's not obvious now. We don't have guineas, we don't use counter stamps. Let me explain that. A pound coin was worth 20 shillings, and it would be expected to have about a pound's worth of gold in it. That's the way that money worked then. But if the state found itself short of funds, it could take in the pounds, it would stamp them with an embossed device called a countermark, and then they would declare that this coin was now a guinea, worth 21 shillings. The value of the gold was the same, but the state had declared these coins to be of greater value because they'd given them an adornment. The state can also adorn a person with some kind of title or honour and declare them to be of greater value than other people. A Man's a Man and Parcel Road have a common theme. That is the total inequality, the sheer impertinence, the absolute incongruous assumption that we should be ruled by people who have been born to rule us, or who have been given titles. These people are still with us, many of them ignorant of real life, many of them inept, yet they have a right to rule over us. And yet how come we also still have coward slaves in our society. Robert Burns was pertinent to his day. So much of what he wrote rang true with us at Democracy for Scotland's Vigil. So much of Burns is still valid today. Just the other day, this struck me. The phrase, the dignity and worth of the human person, sounds like it comes straight out of a Burns verse. And it's not. It's from the preamble to the United Nations Charter, and is a phrase now being used in reference to Ukraine. And to quote him again, forward though I canna see, I guess and fear. I fear his words will remain valid throughout this cruel world for some time to come. The struggle continues. So nobody could say whether he was in favour of devolution, as the question hadn't arisen in his time. But he did live up to his hope that I already quoted, that I, for poor old Scotland's sake, some useful plan or book could make, or sing a sang at least. And he did write this song, commenting on the dissolution of the Scottish Parliament in 1707, 52 years before his birth.
Just over my shoulder, a new building wasn't there 3 years ago. It wasn't there really until Boris Johnson came on the scene. It's there for a purpose. It's not entirely obvious what the purpose is because it's empty at the moment, as though it's been a mistake. Well, it cost over 200 million. It's called Queen Elizabeth House. Imaginative. But there's also a wee clue in there as to its eventual purpose. At the moment, it's the residence of Alistair Jack.
Alistair Jack House, you mean?
What do you use?
The Secretary of State for the UK and Scotland, because he doesn't represent us. We have a parliament that represents us now, I'm very glad to say. It's got 7 floors, can hold 300 civil servants, space for 10 departments. It's got the only cabinet room outside of Downing Street. It's beginning to reveal itself. Oh, but I missed this. Alistair Jack, a borders man who doesn't believe in the border. Remember that? Yeah. The borders don't exist. What? Really? Between North Britain and North Britain there isn't a border? Not according to him. So down there we've got HMRC, legals, actuaries, stats, information. Basically it's a souped up propaganda unit. 95% of the media is not really enough when you want to interfere with democracy. Whoops. So it's not benign, it is a threat, not just to independence, it's a threat to devolution, and as such it's a threat to democracy. The democracy that we sat over there to help to win, the democracy that 75% of people, when they got the chance, said, yeah, we'll have a parliament. I wonder how much it would be percentage-wise now. This thing behind us, God, it's false, but it works. But oh, not straight behind us, but over there, the parliament. Anyway, anyone who's not convinced should look at the recent legislation on the back of Brexit. The Internal Market Act, the Single Market Act, the new Brexit Freedoms Bills, which is going to standardise things or take away alignment to EU standards. The Subsidy Control Bill. And it's in that framework that we've really got to see what is going on, because this is a much more authoritarian regime than we've had for an awful long time, an extremely corrupt regime, and they're going to control things as much as they can, including investment, which Scotland's government has plans for. They will stop.
They want to give us new nuclear power stations as well.
They said, yeah, the nuclear power stations on the bill. And looking at the UK as a whole, we're seeing really sinister stuff. The ending of the Electoral Commission's neutrality, the Elections Bill, which is a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, impersonation. The poor will be excluded. And what have we got out of it? Well, we've got the biggest Union Jack in Britain, maybe. It's just ginormous, it's all the floors down there. But we're not going to get anything out of it. And I think the real purpose is when a Section 30 order is refused, when the Supreme Court bans a referendum, when the Scottish Government win a plebiscite Westminster or Holyrood election, they're going to say enough's enough. This is the alternative government. I know that sounds a bit melodramatic, but I really think you don't build something like that, call it a hub for what, without having an intention which is not obvious at the moment. But anyway, at the end of the day we will win, and it could be the offices for a new Work and Pensions Department, something like that, HMRC, it'll be ours, quite sure of that. So, oh yes, the gazooing. Now, I think the only thing that, since we've been quite musical today, the only thing that we can sing, Stuart, what would you say?
I think you all know it. and this is the perfect instrument to do it. We're going to do the British national anthem on kazoos at them. And you can do any damn thing you like with it. You can jazz it up, you can slow it down, do whatever you like. Because this is us saying to them, we care what you're up to. And you can make up the rest yourself.
Yeah, if you can't remember the words, they go like this. Boo, 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 boo.
So, right, on this, at that key, we'll just start. Okay.
What end is it again?
No second. When we start.
I'm Lindsay Hodger, right? And it's quite an honour to be asked to give a tribute to the Vigil, the people involved and what it achieved. It's quite a responsibility as well. Now, this is St Andrew's House. Until some years ago, it was the main administrative headquarters of the government, the Westminster government in Scotland. It was built as I understand, it was built in the 1930s. A Home Rule Bill for Scotland, as I think Dennis said, got close to being passed in 1913-1914 at the Westminster Parliament, kind of in the wake of the Irish Home Rule Bill, pushed by the Liberals and others. But it got, it didn't quite make it before the outbreak of the First World War. And then the 2 decades after World War I were dominated by the Conservatives, politically. And they weren't going to give Scotland a parliament, but they felt they should do something. So they decided to give it administrative devolution, and they built this building to house the departments that dealt with education and health and housing and things like that in Scotland, which till then had been mainly located in London. So they did something, to be fair to the Tories of those days. Some of them were actually quite keen on some kind of devolution. They gave Scotland a devolution. After another disappointment in getting a Scottish Parliament from the election of 1992, where 73.4% of the Scottish electorate voted for parties that wanted a Scottish Parliament, and we were going to get one. This time, on previous disappointments, really we hadn't done anything. But this time, as you've heard, various people decided we've got to do something. So a vigil got started. I heard about it from my old friend Will Storer, who was by then a professor of divinity. And I think I got here on the first evening. And then I was, became fairly steadily involved until it became difficult because of pressures, work pressures and other things. After a year and a half, I kept in touch, but I didn't have time to do so much. So it was Democracy of Scotland, as people at the Vigil called themselves, decided they had to keep this vigil going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until we got a referendum on the Scottish Parliament, which seemed very ambitious because the prospect was rather remote. But the vigil got started. Later that spring, as I understand, civil servant was going into the building in the morning And in front of them was a group of people, including Michael Forsyth, who was then the Tory Secretary of State for Scotland. I got this from a very reliable source. He's standing right there. And Michael Forsyth had glanced across the road to the Vigil that summer and said, well, they'll not be here after one hard winter.
So let's tell him what to think of it.
Well, Michael Forsyth was so wrong. Somehow through 5 long cold winters, the flame of democracy for Scotland was kept burning and tended day and night. A remarkable achievement. I never, but after 5 years, in the May election of 1997, Michael Forsyth was gone. I never slept at the Vigil overnight, as some did. Warm sleeping bags, very much needed. But I sometimes did my 2-hour stint late at night in winter on the way home from my work in Down Street, not too far away. I can still feel that snell east wind off the North Sea. Oh gosh. How did we manage to keep it going? Well, real commitment from those involved, fresh faces joining us in year 2, year 3, year 4, giving great support and much time, as some of us, like me, found it difficult through increasing work pressure and other things to give it quite so much time. There was all kinds of support from the public, that helped as well. Passing drivers tooted their horns. People dropped by with food, firewood, cachinations. One Saturday afternoon, I was there, and straggles of Rangers supporters were walking back from a game in Easter Road, right, on this side of the pavement. Now, I don't know how well some of you will be familiar with the tendencies of Rangers supporters, politically and culturally. But to my, this group straggling along there, to my surprise, 2 of them looked across the road and gave us a thumbs up sign.
A thumbs up?
Thumbs up, approval.
Just checking our head that right.
Yeah, thumbs up. So that was a bit of a surprise, but then the others in the group, many more, started singing Rule Britannia. And that was a wee bit more of what you would expect. But it was interesting. I think the diversity and breadth of support helped. Supporters came from the Green Party, the Lib Dems, like me, then from the Labour Party, from SNP, and many without a party affiliation. That so many very, very different individuals were involved and worked together. To be honest, I think sometimes some of us thought a lot of the others were really quite eccentric. You know?
And the others, not yourself?
No, not as they say in Yorkshire. They're all daft except thee and me.
And even thee.
And I have my doubts about thee sometimes.
My
right,
dad
okay.
used to say that.
Anyway, but so many different people were able to work together, helped. So it was diverse and it was inclusive. Now, many of those involved showed a liking for this kind of diversity, and a kind of vague inclusiveness was an encouraging pointer to Scotland's future, I felt. Narrow nationalism, that phrase we hear so often from our opponents, it was certainly not. Why was it so important to keep it going? Well, to be honest, in hard political electoral terms, I don't think we shifted the voting patterns very much in Scotland. In 1972, 73.6% of the electorate voted for parties committee to a Scottish Parliament on a 75.5% turnout. 5 years later, in the 1997 referendum, 74.3 voted yes. So maybe we gained 7%.
It was still in the 70s. It should be like that for independence now.
Yeah, and that was on a 60.2% turnout. But what the Vigil did do, though, was it made clear the strength of commitment to a Scottish Parliament right on the doorsteps of the Conservative administration, across the road in St Andrew's House. So we had a great location, and it was only 2 minutes from Princes Street and Waverley Station. I think what it also achieved was the Vigil trained a very public focus on the democratic deficit in Scotland. It became a well-recognised symbol and a recognised go-to place for television, radio, media, even just for short clips on programmes about Scottish political situation, also from newspaper. So it became a focus. And from that publicity, it became a place for members of the public to go to learn more about the campaign for the Scottish Parliament, find out how they could help, how they could support it, and perhaps for people who'd become a bit discouraged by the decades of a Parliament being thwarted undemocratically, it was a place where they could come, restore the spirits, and see that this time it was going to be different. Also helped to remind Scotland's dominant Labour MPs, some of whom had campaigned for no in 1979, they shall be nameless here, but some of us remember who they were, to remind Scotland's Labour MPs of the strength of feeling and commitment in the country. And then, after Tony Blair's huge victory in May 1997, the Vigil kept going. So he knew the commitment was still there. Now, I have a particular, more personal memory of the Vigil, which I think says something about it. My family are from Ayrshire, and I only had one relative in Edinburgh, my wonderful Aunt Jean, also from Ayrshire. I had lunch with her nearly every Saturday over her tatties and mince. Her tatties and mince have never been surpassed. We talked about everything. But I always avoided politics. It was clear, you know, she always voted Conservative. She was from a kind of more middle-class branch of the family, whereas I'm from a sort of rural farming, working-class branch. Once when a possible Scottish Parliament came up, she said she was really opposed. She didn't want separation from some relatives and close friends in Ilford and Essex. She thought a Parliament meant separation. She was very involved with the Church of Scotland in Gilberton. She was Secretary of the Women's Guild there for 40 years. She had a natural gift for getting on with everyone. She was a good, quiet organiser in a friendly way. Now, on Christmas Day 1992, or maybe it was 1993, I invited her to have Christmas dinner with me at a restaurant in Jeffrey Street. As we couldn't go through to Ayrshire for Christmas, which we usually did, for some reason that year we couldn't. It was a beautiful, clear, still, sunny day. On the way to the restaurant, I took a detour, having picked her up in Gilmerton, took a detour to the Vigil, because I can't remember what it was, but I needed to see someone there, or probably sign up for a duty hour or two, or maybe wanted to wish the people who were giving up their Christmas Day for the Vigil to wish them a Merry Christmas. I parked went into the hut. Then Aunt Jane, who was then 88 or 89, depending on which year it was, got out. I went over to the fire and started talking to 2 or 3 people standing there. When I eventually came out of the hut, she was really enjoying talking to the people there. Probably people she would never meet in her social circle in Gilmerton or at the church. In the car, she told me she'd enjoyed her visit to the vigil and said the people there were nice and polite. Several weeks later, somehow, over our lunches, the vigil of the Scottish Parliament came up again, and she said, to my surprise, "Lindsay, I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to come." Meaning the Scottish Parliament. I think she sensed things were changing, and probably her visit to the vigil, the people and her conversations at the vigil helped. Though I've no idea what they were talking about. I was in the hut all the time. Sadly, she died in 1996. Had she been able to vote in the 1997 referendum, she would probably have voted no. But sometimes I wonder if she might have seriously considered yes and even voted that way. Probably not, but whatever. I'll always cherish that memory of that sunny Christmas day as a memory of the vigil and as a compliment to the vigil, and also of my wonderful Aunt Jean and the surprising connection I now have between them. Now, since 2014, it's been widely said across various parts of the independence movement that to move forward, a priority is to engage no voters, particularly the soft nose in constructive, patient, respectful dialogue. So, independence folks, buy Socratic dialogue.
Yeah.
But my problem is that, in my experience, particularly in Ayrshire, we're not that good at Socratic dialogue. In Ayrshire, I'm more used to rather robust, even hostile argument, even verbal battles about anything, almost. At the vigil, however, there were often long, informative and constructive discussions with people who had dropped by, or among ourselves. So the vigil was a good example in this context, and I think my Aunt Jean would probably agree. All that gives us good reason to express a deep and warm appreciation of all who helped to keep the vigil going and contributed in so many different ways to its success, practically, socially, culturally, and even campaign-wise. All have played a part in restoring the Parliament of Scotland, and I would argue, to thereby making the feeling that Scotland, as a nation, has the full right of national self-determination. To make that feeling that we really do have self-determination much more real. Previously it was kind of abstract and theoretical, but now it's much more real than at any time, probably since 1707. We have to pay particular respect to those then who contributed to the vigil, but have since passed away. By the very nature of the vigil, the roll of names that I'm going to read may be incomplete and miss some who really should be mentioned here. If that's the case, I apologise for that. So, I'm going to read the names and ask for a minute's silence after they're read, I'm sure many of us will possibly also want to, okay, as well as remembering our Vigil colleagues who passed away, we'll perhaps want to remember friends and colleagues who dearly wanted a Scottish Parliament and worked hard for it, but passed away in those frustrating and long decades when it was being thwarted undemocratically. To stand as representatives for these, perhaps I can mention two people. I'd like to mention two people. The Scottish Gaelic poet, Solly MacLean, who died in 1996, passionately wanted the Scottish Parliament. And his and my good friend, the scholar of the Scots language, Jim Stevenson, who died just after the election in 1992, also deeply wanted the Scottish Parliament and helped to support me on that. So maybe you'll accept these two people as representing the two linguistic halves of our culture. So with our deep respects, our colleagues at the Vigil no longer with us, but I feel still here today in spirit. Helen Allen, Ivor Burney, Mark Canavan, Callum James MacDonald Duncan, Heather Dunlop, Laurie Dunlop, Nell Dunn, David Hamilton, Hamish Henderson, Gordon Ingalls, Nick Simpson, Ken Skeel, Lewis Stevenson, Ian Thompson, Gail Turnbull, George Wiley, Willie Young.
those of you that don't know me, I'm Stuart McHardy, and I was there at the beginning and at the end of the vigil, and I'd just like to say, particularly after that incredibly moving experience that we've all just had, that I don't think there's anything in my life I'll ever be more proud of than being part of the vigil. It was a truly magnificent thing, and everybody that took part in it was as important as anybody else. But one of the things we did do at the vigil was we had a bit of a focus on Scottish history, and that's why we're here in a way, because this particular monument was raised in honour of a bunch of gentlemen who were sent out to Australia, transported, because of an event that took place on the 12th of December 1792. 200 years later to the day, there was a march here in Edinburgh calling for what they were calling for, democracy, because that's what they were. They called it in their time reform, but they were just wanting true democratic representation. And the vigil was the gathering point for the 25,000 people who turned up that day, which at the time was the biggest political demonstration I think that had ever been seen in Edinburgh. And it was of such matter to all of us that were involved that we thought we should make this known, that this was 200 years to the day. Now you all know how the media love anniversaries, don't you? The night before, every newspaper, radio station, television station and news agency and photographic agency in Edinburgh received a briefing document about the fact that this march was taking place on this significant anniversary. And not one of them mentioned it. We still have the same problem today. We are dealing with institutions and media outlets that are so bloody thick in the head they can't see which way the wind is blowing. So this is not a reason in any way to be downhearted. It's actually, I think, the fact that we're here 30 years on proves that what we did, and Lindsay summed it up very well, he said we were a focus. We provided an opportunity for the media to have a photograph whenever devolution was mentioned, because in the early 90s the media were being increasingly Mordecai'd, and if you couldn't get a picture you wouldn't get a story, was basically what it was about. And the vigil gave them that story. And we also were aware of the fact that we were inheritors of these people. Many of you will have heard of Thomas Muir, but he was only one of many. And the guys that are commemorated here on this magnificent monument, raised by public subscription in 1840, and it still doesn't have a plaque on the outside of the cemetery yet, is, I think, to this day, a shining example to us all of the problems that we still face. We don't know our own history, we're not given our own history, and we are effectively sidelined. But by coming here on the 12th of December 92, we laid a bunch of white roses in honour of these people, and I'm going to ask Gillian to do that again, to lay a bunch of white roses at the foot of the Martyrs' Memorial in their honour, but now, 30 years on, also in honour of those that we've just mentioned who've passed, and also in honour of all of those who came and maybe only did 1 2-hour shift at the vigil, or 2 2-hour shifts, or once a month they would come. Because what made the vigil, as what made the guys do what they did in 1792, was the people. Because the martyrs, as they're called, the political martyrs, were representative of a vast number of people who had joined the Friends of the People in Scotland. And it's just, in passing, it's worth noting that you could join the Friends of the People in Scotland for 3 pence. Friends of the People in England was 3 guineas. And it tells you something about the different histories of these two nations, and it's time they were separated again. I've also been asked to say something briefly about someone who's already been mentioned. And that's Hamish Henderson, who, when asked would he be the public face of the Vigil, because we were effectively barred from all of the large-scale public meetings about devolution that were organised by the Labour Party. They just wouldn't let us on. But we thought if we get Hamish to go up and say, I am here representing the Vigil, they wouldn't be able to say no. And he got it. Boy, did he get it. And so he served, I suppose, in a way as our spokesperson. And he inspired a great many of us. And he knew that things were slow building, but he was sure that they would build and that we would eventually triumph. And it's a great testament to you all today for turning up. Because I've said already, it's the proudest thing I've ever done. And I hope it has pride in your hearts when you think back of the people with whom we sat around that stinking, smelly, bloody fire. Whether it was in the winter or the summer, you needed a separate set of clothes to be at bed. I've still got mine. And they still smell. Bloody ridiculous. So, we've laid the flowers in honour of the political martyrs. We're not going to have to martyr ourselves, but we're going to have to still work to do a bit more. And from here, we have one last stop. And the plan was we were going to light our democracy cairn. Because remember that the democracy cairn that's up there on the top of Carlton Hill was the Vigil's cairn. And it's a sign of the times that things have changed so much. When we asked to do it, it was then a Labour Party. And the head of the Labour Party in Lothian was Mark Lazarovich. And I was sent to ask him, we're wanting to put up a cairn. Of course you can, he says, it's the People's Hill. And it's I been the People's Hill. And it's where the rioters that used to express the voice of the people in the 17th and 18th centuries, that's where they always went for a berry afterwards. So it's well established as a good place. So we're going to go there, but I have to apologise, I'm not going to be raising the need fire as was publicised, because I've been working with a board drill all week and I just can't hack it. So we'll have to use firelighters. So, onwards and upwards.
Mainly takes place here, but hold on, I'll let this happen first. And pile it up there. You're in.
That's really good.
Oh, see, I just name, I think.
Oh, look what's going on up there.
Oh.
It's very pagan, isn't it?
So anyway, that's good to see a wee light up there. I'll tell you a wee story about something like that in a minute. While in the office one day, this big burly man with big giant hands came in, and he said, he introduced himself and all that, and he was very impressive. And he asked us if we could maybe help him with a project, and it turns out it was this. So he had designed this to commemorate the Vigil and everything he's been talking about. And so we came that day, we made it with unemployed people. I done most of the welding, and Ian designed it to look like a quaich, a cup of kindness. But he did this bit himself, I think, the cairn. And if you look closely on it, it's got lots of commemorations to other movements. It's got different stones for places like the Paris Commune and Auschwitz and other places like are meaningful to what he was trying to convey. It's also got plaques and memories on it and things like that as well. Anyway, I welded up this and the guys all helped me, and we'd got some guys to do castings which went into all the wee holes around the sides to commemorate different cultures and things like that. So, but he was a fine big guy, and he's got a kind of special place in my heart. And but I can't tell an awful lot about him because he's a bit of a mystery apart from all his shenanigans. But they called him in the Herald was it a creative thorn in the side of the authorities. That pretty much describes him pretty well. But on the day that we come up here, we fastened it onto the top of the cairn. There was a big group of people, maybe 30 or 40 people, and we had a piper, and we got a fire going and we lit it. I'll get to the lit. But we had invited Dougie thingy, what's his name again? Dougie McLean, but Dougie couldn't make it, unfortunately. So everybody was getting a bit impatient. Ian went, I know who'll do it, and he went away and disappeared. And we went, where's he gone? And he come back with Hamish Henderson. So, who's that? And so we helped old Hamish get up the hill here, and he sang Freedom Come All Ye, and he got a stick and lit it and it went up, and the fire's going, we were all cheering. And it was brilliant, and he was very, very proud. He said some really nice things. He gave him a wee bit of hope that the fire was still lit, metaphorically and physically. But we're just standing like this. It was much brighter, but it was cloudy like this as well. And as sometimes happens, the clouds opened up to reveal a big saltire in the sky. Just at the very moment you want it, you know. It was like pure Hollywood. And it was just two jets, obviously, you know, but just everybody got a big cheer. But it was a wonderful occasion, and I think it's, for myself, when I was at the Pollock Free State protesting, my sister used to come along as well, and we used to bring the nephews and nieces and things. But eventually the motorway went through, and we decided to fight for what we wanted rather than what we were against, and that's how the Galgale Trust came about. But my sister went on to start her own motorway protest for another road that was going through Govan Hill, and then she got into politics. Then she eventually became an MSP, and she gets sworn in, and they swear to the Queen down the hill there, and she swore in with "My oath is to the people" written on her hand. So that was in all over the newspapers. So I was very proud of her that day. And later on, her nephew brought out a book called The Poverty Safari, and it was a bestseller and won the Orwell Prize. So what I'm saying is, none of us were political, we're from a poor background, but when we were in a place that was full of political energy, it had a really positive effect on us. It empowered us, and meet people like Big Ian and all people like yourselves. You learn so much, and the ripples go out. So everything you do, even if it's small, has an effect. And I would say keep on pushing. People listen eventually. I wasn't political at all, but I've been involved in tons of things now over the years, and so I'll not hold you back any longer. Can we get that going again?
We're going to have to go and see.
Ladders. You're taking steps to do something about it?
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks everybody for turning up and everything. That's really, I quite like that. I was involved in the Destiny March, the stretch from Iona to Edinburgh, and I can't even remember how long it took even. Well, disclaimer here is that it was 30 years ago, so some of the facts, they might not be correct.
What was the Destiny March?
You were on the Iona March, it was 3 weeks.
The Destiny March was a march that was designed on the first year commemoration of the Vigil, and it came from 4 points: Iona, Whithorn, Arbroath and Berwick-upon-Tweed. Is that right?
To make a
saltire, a spidery like saltire, because you can't walk through mountains and that.
We went over them.
Yeah, we went over them. I found out about it from an artist friend I know called Justine Blair. She must have known people. I wasn't very political at the time. I didn't know much. I was quite naive. I was 26, I think, but I was a pretty young 26. And when I found out about it, I agreed to do it, and my friend Deke, also Derek Lothian, agreed to do it too. And to prepare for it, I walked up and down Arthur's Seat and round about on the hills, and I was told to dab a surgical spirit on my feet to make the skin hard, and it worked. I borrowed, yeah, I borrowed a pair of walking boots from a friend, but when I was walking up and down Arthur's Seat, they were really just made a mess of my feet. So I got a pair of trainers, and I did the walk with trainers. I got a phone call from a guy called Ian offering us a lift up there, and it turned out to be Ian Hamilton QC, the guy that stole the Stone of Destiny from, with other people from Westminster Abbey. And he phoned me up and he said, "Are you sure you're up for this?" He poetically said that the leaves on the hawthorn weren't out yet up there, which I thought was nice. And I told him a lie. I said, "Oh, I'm well up for it. I used to walk from Haddington to Edinburgh just about every week." So I lied to a QC because I didn't want to be talked out of it. So that's why I did. And he never caught on, which was brilliant. So he gave us a lift to North Cornwall, where he stayed. We stayed with him. He gave me a signed copy of his book, which was The Taking of the Stone of Destiny, which I would recommend. If you've not read it, it's a brilliant read. It runs like an Ealing comedy. He even breaks it at one point. You should read it, it's really funny. And then from North Cornwall, we went on to Iona. We got a good welcome. We stayed there the night, and it was lovely. And then the next day when we were leaving, they sung us this lovely Celtic hymn as we walked away. It was very moving. So with that energy of the Celtic hymn, we walked across the water like Jesus back to Iona. That's how I remember it anyway. And then we continued with our walk across Mull, which was brilliant, over the side of Benmore. I had never been further north than Crieff.
My involvement with the Vigil, I first heard of the Vigil back in the summer in 1994. I used to live in Stockbridge, and of course a lot of you will know that the Vigil used to do the mini Vigils. They were very popular and very successful back in the day, and just a case of spreading the word, as well as getting much needed funds. And that's when I first heard of the Vigil, and that was the Stockbridge Festival. It was July 1994, and I remember seeing the stall. It was like a wee stall. In a small way, we've all contributed to that part of Scottish political history. So there we go.
I'd just like to thank everybody who came and everybody who took part. The cabin went to the Scottish Mental Health Association garden in Redwall in southwest Edinburgh. The man that took it phoned me the night before, and I thought, oh dear, he's going to cancel. And it was half the price of it from Edinburgh. What he was phoning to do was to say, I'm doing it for nothing. And that was the spirit that was going about. When we, on our last nights, the police cars were the sirens on ambulances, continental coaches, everybody seemed to be in a sense of jubilation. And yeah, not many things last 5.5 years and actually work. There's a sense of failure. So I'm going to mention two names. John has just come up here, and I'm so pleased that he spoke. John was there so much, and Willie and us, and John was standing. You'll see him in the photographs. The other person you'll see in the photographs is a lady, a very glamorous lady. She's in almost them all, and when she's not in them, it's because she's taking them. Does anybody know who I'm talking about?
Grant, I believe.
The lady that whose name you dare not speak.
Thank you for your
Gillian, let's give it up for Gillian. And thank you. Over to the musicians.
To freedom.
Do you?
They need the lights.
Oh, it is dawning, for the clouds will still be down the lane.
It's the thought that will gather robins, all the rose and gals, fresh and gay. Dark the road and secret our loanings, for their old loves we sport and play. So come all ye that came with freedom, never heed what the hoodies croak for doom. In your house all the bairns o' Adam can find breed, barley brie and painted room. When MacLean meets with friends in Springburn, all the roses and gains will turn to bloom. And the blackbird fae on Nyanga dings the fell gallows o' the burghers.